But to me, it's okay that they think those things, because the way someone thinks about me, I don't have a problem with that. My main thing is I would never want someone to think that I would hurt Gannon or any of the children in our home, because that's just not the case.
Do you think she just took off? Do you think?
I mean, right now I don't even want to just like throw anything out there. Like, I hope that she's somewhere safe right now and with the kids. But I mean, could she just taken off? I don't know. But if somebody has her and they're not safe, like, I want them back now. Like, that's what's in my head. Like, if they're safe right now, they're gonna come back.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most credible voice in true crime. In this episode, we're gonna look at 10 similarities between the Chris Watts case and the Gannon Stauch case. Now, those who know True Crime Rocket Science know that I don't really refer to it as similarities, I refer to it as intertextualities. Whether it's a true crime intertextuality, in other words, a broad intertextuality between one case and another, or criminal intertextuality where the criminal is actually learning from another criminal. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that a little bit later. I first just want to kind of run through the 10 similarities. And although I've sort of started this just showing you a couple of the sort of optical similarities, just looking at the buttoned up neighborhood from above, we're going to come back to that right at the end. And you must bear in mind, if you are being, I won't say triggered, but if what you are seeing resonates with you, if you're being reminded, if there's kind of a sense of deja vu, then you must know the exact same thing is happening with the criminals involved. And I'm talking about before they commit the crime. They also would bear in mind Letitia was living in her neighborhood. She must have watched the Watts case. It had to have come onto her radar. She had to have recognized in the Watts situation just that her neighborhood looked like his neighborhood, right? And this whole thing of children disappearing, I mean, obviously in the Stauch case it's more than that, but it also is about making a child disappear, and that is a similarity between both cases. But let's move on and just go through the 10 points, okay? So the first point is that both crimes happened on a Monday. And both crimes happened on a Monday in the context of the spouse being away on a business trip. Now, what are we talking about when that is happening? What are we talking about when you have a situation where a child that is part of the fabric of the family comes to some kind of harm within the context of the other parent isn't there, right? And well, what we're talking about is a situation where with a parent away, there is kind of the opportunity to harm someone without interference. In other words, without the protector of that child, the guardian of that child, the custodian of that child interfering with this, the execution of this crime. Now, I know there are a lot of people who still believe that Chris Watts committed the crime, a premeditated crime, kind of at the last second. He sort of, or even after Shanann arrived home. So that Shanann arrived home and then, I don't know, I'm not quite sure what people believe, but that Chris Watts killed Shanann, then took the kids to the well site and killed them there, or something like that, or that one of them was killed in the home. I don't really know exactly what people believe in that respect, but I don't believe that's what happened. in any event, even if you do believe that that is what happened, where Shanann was killed first, it's still a situation where the parent is out of the way, because the parent would have fought like a tiger and interfered with this desire to do away with a young child, right? So it's a situation where one spouse is absent. That's the part that I want to emphasize. Now, in the Chris Watts case, I believe that the children were killed quite early on the Sunday night, and a couple of reasons to support that is, one was that Shanann asked for photos of the children in bed, and he couldn't provide that to them. He didn't provide that to them. And Chris Watts wasn't in the habit of not doing what Shanann asked. You know, she'd asked him previously to send photos or whatever, and then he would. And on this occasion, he resent photos that he'd already sent. And that, I think, is the big giveaway. There are other things as well, like the neighbor not seeing the children and all that. And we can talk about the driveway stuff in a second, because that's point number 2. Both cases have got this sort of fuzzy surveillance footage. And in both cases, I think people were completely kind of convinced of whatever scenario, and I believe people were wrong in both cases. So in the Watts case, people were convinced that the children were still alive, even though even Frank Rusek during the sentencing hearing said, you know, you took the children out of the house like trash. I saw it on video. He said those words in the sentencing. So at that time, Frank Rusek and the DA and the prosecution's case, law enforcement's case, was that, okay? Although the prosecution wasn't absolutely sure when the crime had happened. Anyway, the point being, you have this surveillance footage that isn't, it's kind of this weird thing where you've got something happening on camera, but you can't really tell what it is. It's this weird thing of, you've got evidence, you can see something's happening, but you can't actually tell what is happening, and it's almost raising more questions than giving you answers. Of course, when you have surveillance footage, what one needs to concentrate on are kind of the basics, like what time is this happening? Can one confirm the identity of this person? And then, you know, what vehicle are they doing? Is it odd that the behavior is happening in the first place? Is it odd that they're leaving at this time? All that kind of thing, right? And not get bogged down in the stuff that you don't know. So what is the surveillance footage telling you that is just a basic thing, like the time, you know, in terms of the timelines? So that's useful. And when the truck comes back, that forms a very strong part of I'm talking about in the Stauch case. When the truck comes back, that's a very important part of informing the timeline from there. So another very interesting case where you've also got surveillance footage, but it doesn't really help you, is the Frazee case, where, you know, everyone goes into the house, but there's no evidence of a body being taken out. And yet her body had to have been taken out because Kelsey Bereth wasn't found deceased in her home. So that is the sort of weird thing with surveillance footage. And I think what's not really appreciated very much with the surveillance footage is, especially if it's motion activated and digital, you sometimes have the digital picking up certain frames and then missing others. And especially when it's dark, you can sort of see something moving and then it sort of disappears and then you see it again. So it does have this sort of almost selective, scattered recording, if that makes sense, of things going on. And that can create a little bit of confusion. But what I found ironic with the Stauch case and the Watts case was this thing where everything seemed to turn on the surveillance footage. And that is a mistake. A lot of times where there's a not a smoking gun in a true crime case, it's a mistake to sort of hold something up as the full be all end all of the case, like the hinge around which everything rotates. And often people will sort of hold up DNA and say this is a DNA case. Just because of this piece of DNA, that's the sole. But a circumstantial evidence case is about a mosaic. It's about all these different things. And that is why something like fuzzy surveillance footage shouldn't be the sort of number one thing that you focus on. It should be part of that mosaic. Okay. So in the Stauch case, the surveillance, and this is kind of an ironic thing. In the Stauch case, the surveillance footage didn't clearly show Gannon arriving home. So because you didn't see him, people assumed that he didn't come home and that he was probably murdered somewhere outdoors, which I just find, I've always thought of that as a ridiculous thing. Is why would you commit a murder outside? I mean, it's got so many difficulties associated with that line of sight. Where you're going to find a safe place? There's so many random factors there. Whereas in a home, you've got so much more time to do it, and you are in a closed, secure space that and you know the movements of people to and from. So it makes far more sense to do it inside a home. Anyway, people thought that the crime happened outside because they didn't see Gannon returning. And you kind of have the opposite happening in the Watts case, where people said, I think I saw a child, so the crime must have happened outside. Of course, you didn't see a child, you saw something else, you saw something that could be something, but people still made assumptions based on what they thought they saw. Whereas in the Stauch case, it was assumptions based on what they thought they didn't see. But the fact that you can't get away from in both cases is the surveillance footage isn't clear. And just that alone should say, okay, we're going to need other evidence besides this. And what a lot of people didn't realize was that the cops, in terms of the Stauch case, had found blood in Gannon's room. And so they realized that is the crime scene. And then they put other things together, like the movements from the ADT sensors and all that kind of thing. But basically, the part I just want to highlight here is the fact that you kind of have most people misinterpreting both these cases based on the surveillance footage. And I hope the lesson we can take out of this is to treat surveillance footage with caution. Not to infer too much from what you see or you don't see. Take the basics, look at the time stamps and look at what is basically happening. So for example, one thing you could ask is, why the heck was Letitia driving her husband's truck, right? In the Chris Watts case, is he leaving at a normal time? And would he normally back his truck on the driveway, up on the driveway? Same with Letitia. Would she normally back the truck the way that she was doing? And those are things that you really want to look at. And what that is pointing towards is, yes, it's suspicious behavior, right? You have quite a few cases like this of trucks backing up. It's the same thing happened in the Scott Peterson case. Right, and so we go into point number 3, social media and even multi-level marketing are present in both cases. I don't think that needs to be emphasized very much. We know how much Shanann was involved in social media, and weirdly you have a situation where Chris Watts was absolutely not kind of a presence on social media. There's a little bit of his activity on Twitter on the Sunday that gives us an idea of what he was thinking about, but otherwise very little. And then also the doll wrapped in the plastic mat that was sent to Shanann. But other than that, there's very little sort of social media artifacts in terms of the Chris Watts side, whereas on the Letitia Stauch side, there's a heck of a lot. Of course, social media just in general, in terms of Shanann's social media and what we saw with the children, and the fact that she wasn't on social media alerted her friends that something was wrong. It was a way that they could keep a hold of her. To a lesser extent, as far as I know, this is unconfirmed, but as far as I know, Letitia was also involved in MLM, not to the extent that Shanann was, but also involved, as far as I understand. I could be wrong on that one. Number 4, the explanation was the same in terms of the disappearance. What happened to this person that's gone? Well, went to a friend. And both of them, Watts and Stauch, couldn't say which friend. So that was kind of interesting. And then both of them had sort of evolving stories from there, like what had happened and so on. Point number 5, both have the same modus operandi in terms of remote disposal. Watts drove about 45 minutes or so to Roggan and to a secure site, and Letitia looks like she drove around about the same distance to past Palmer Lake, right? So it's the same thing of driving a body a long way from home. In the Watts case, we know Shanann was killed at home, but she was then driven a long distance from there. I believe the same applies to the children, but the point being, where the bodies are disposed of is a long way from home. In the Watts case, it was at his work site, which he may have thought was a good idea based on the secureness of the location. Of course, on the other hand, it would link directly to him. And then he drove due east to get to Roggan, whereas Letitia drove kind of northwest, northwest, but also right on to the other side of Colorado Springs. So just that sense of remote disposal. Of course, in the Stauch case, it ended up being extremely remote ultimately. Number 6, the role of GPS. I think that's self-explanatory, but I think what it really shows in the Stauch case is having the GPS isn't a guarantee of finding a body very quickly. A lot of people made the mistake to say, wow, Chris Watts, what an idiot. His truck had GPS, they would have found the bodies immediately anyway. No. They would have had a rough idea where his vehicle went, but anywhere along that point where the vehicle went, and every point where it stopped could be a potential disposal site, and now you've got to investigate it. And Chris Watts went to several well sites that day, and he made more than one stop on the way to Roggan and on the way back. Number 7, the role of home security sensors. Interestingly, it kind of played a bigger role in the Stauch case than the Watts case. In the Watts case, there is a little bit of that information. By the way, I recently came across just a post with the Watts children playing with their grandfather on a trampoline in Spring Lake. It's quite a touching scene. I put it up on Patreon, but I was trying to find the date for that incident, and you can see Bella's ankle is sensitive, it's tender. She's sort of struggling to jump on the trampoline. And I remember Shanann saying somewhere in the discovery that Bella had hurt her ankle and she may need special shoes. And so I went to find that in the discovery, and that comes from July 30th. That was when that message was sent. And on the same day, Shanann sort of talks to Watts. Bear in mind, he's about to leave the very next day to come to North Carolina to meet them. She's very concerned about the Vivint, right? Because probably Shanann's been expecting to keep track of Chris Watts and his movements, and there's just not been very much activity in the house, and she's sort of wondering what the hell is going on. And the garage sensor's broken, probably something he did on purpose, but he basically says in the discovery for July the 30th, says he's talking to Vivint and he's going to be fixing the sensitivity, which is quite interesting. Now, what's also interesting is the guy putting together the discovery, the phone data review, says Chris Watts wasn't on the phone when he sent that text to Shanann, and yet he said, I'm still on the phone talking to them. So one gets the feeling he purposefully didn't want the Vivint sensors to pick up what he was doing, because bear in mind he was having an affair for those whole weeks, right? Didn't want to pick up his comings and goings out of the house. Ironically, the sensors, the ADT system at the Stauch home is far more, gives us far more detail about the movements, especially when it looks like the murders actually happened, which shows a lot of movement between the basement and upstairs, which would, I agree with the affidavit, it would tend to suggest someone running up and down quite a lot to clean things up, to dispose of bedding, bloodied bedding and all that kind of thing. Number 8, finances. So the finances were clearly in a terrible state in the Watts family. I don't think they were in a terrible state with the Stauch family, but they certainly weren't great, which is why Letitia talks about she didn't want to drive her leased vehicle to put mileage on it. So that's the first clue that things weren't going great. The other clue is that she lost her job literally on the Friday, and then Gannon died on the Monday. So one can imagine that financial stress was part of it, which it would be for anybody if you've just lost your job. And bear in mind, Gannon could have been sick, but he was also kind of an expense. He was a family expense. And maybe Letitia felt the same way that Chris Watts did, that he was just too expensive in her mind. I don't think it's just expensive in terms of money, but also in terms of time and effort and the kind of psychological toll, right? So I think it's that expense as well. But I do think the finances weren't great in both families. Number 9, and this is quite interesting, online research. We know that Watts Googled OxyContin or oxycodone 80 milligrams. And what's quite interesting with the Watts case is, I literally asked for a recording of Watts saying, okay, look, I got the oxy from the basement. He then provided it, and then people thought that was fake news or a hoax. So it's quite interesting that, sometimes you have information, but people simply just choose not to believe it. And that's also what's quite interesting with the surveillance footage. Sometimes you see something, in other words, a digital device records something for what it is, and you just can't see what it is. And you make it up for whatever it is. And that's the kind of weird thing with the Watts case, is like, for example, it made complete sense that Watts would want to bring about the miscarriage. I don't think his first choice was to wipe out his whole family. I mean, he was for a long time a devoted husband, a loving father, a doting father, a guy who played with his kids. And so I don't think his first choice was to do that. I think his first choice was, I'm scared to death having this child. I don't want a third child. I did want a third child. Now I don't want a third child. But then Shanann wanted the child, wanted the marriage to continue. He didn't. And so I think he took the cowardly way out, and he tried to bring about a miscarriage using an idiotic strategy, and it didn't work, and then he probably tried it a second time with a higher dose. We know that Shanann felt very ill and out of sorts on the 2 occasions that he is supposed to have given her this dose, so that also makes sense. But what I'm trying to say is, I don't know, it's a little bit ironic. He does the Google search, right? It's deleted as well, which is a big red flag. When the book comes out and he mentions it, that he tried to bring about a miscarriage, which was arguably the biggest revelation in the letters from Christopher, his family suddenly get very nervous because it looks like did they conspire, and because his sister's a nurse, did she help with this? And because they're very, they've already borne the brunt of the social media shitstorm, they asked him, won't you please set the record straight and just tell people we had nothing to do with it? And so they asked, and then they contacted a couple of YouTube creators in order to do that, to set the record straight, and I was one of them. And I then said, look, no one's going to believe you if you just have the statement from him. You're going to need him to actually say it. And the problem was, when he said it, he sort of said it with, he said something and then they responded, and then he said something else and they responded, and they didn't want their voices to be in that recording, and so it was broken up into, I think, 3 recordings. But it's basically Chris Watts saying, it was me. I got the oxy from the basement, and I took it on the plane, and something like that. Anyway, the point being, people will listen to that and say, I don't think Chris, this is Chris Watts, I don't think he sent it to this creator. I don't think blah, 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 blah. And if you think about it contextually, all of it makes sense. If you think of it in another way, you say, well, I don't believe it. And then what? So is that, what is that? Is it just random bits of information? Is it like random pieces of someone's voice cobbled together to pretend something? Now you could say that, except think about what was going on at the time. It was in international news, it was in the Daily Mail article, this thing about the OxyContin. And at the time, I remember on social media, everyone was saying, so who's the accessory now? Who helped Chris Watts get the OxyContin? Was it Nicole Kessinger? Was it his parents? Was it his sister? And obviously it was none of those people, but because of what he'd said in the letter, now suddenly, I'm going to take this to my grave, everyone gravitated around that. But the point is, wouldn't you expect a walking back or a explanation around this huge revelation? In other words, doesn't it make sense? But of course there are a lot of people out there which simply say, I don't trust this creator, and I don't trust Chris Watts, so I'm just going to ignore this. But that's you projecting your own lack of a grasp of what is going on. And do you know, I actually contacted a reporter at a kind of quite a respected publication that covers crime. In fact, it's covered quite a lot of the Letitia Stauch case, and they simply didn't believe it either. They were like, why would he contact you? Maybe because Crime Rocket is one of the most consistent reporters of this case, and neutral. It's never been on the Rusek side, it's never been on Chris Watts' side, simply just trying to say what happened, right? Anyway, that's been a long spiel just about that, but the online aspect, I think, is really, really interesting. And it's almost one of the easiest things to manipulate is the online information, which is exactly what Letitia Stauch did with her. She also contacted YouTube creators indirectly and tried to influence the story. And prior to the crime, she Googled Colorado law. What does Colorado law say about leaving one's son at home? Can I? And obviously, that's not what she was wanting to do. She didn't want to leave Gannon at home and drive somewhere. I don't think. I think it was the whole thing about how do you explain that according to you, your son was sick and then you left him at home alone? Why didn't you take him to the doctor? In other words, she was trying to find a defense for her actions before she acted. That makes sense. Looking at what Colorado law says, that's how I interpret it. And then the final thing that I want to mention here is, for me, just very, very compelling. And it is just how the neighborhoods, the neighborhood of Saratoga Trail and the neighborhood of Mandan Drive, how similar they look. And it's not just that, it's also there's a T-junction right before both houses, and both houses are slightly to the right of the T-junction. So if you're looking at the T-junction from behind each house, it's slightly to the right of the T-junction. If you on the T-junction, slightly to the left of the house. And that's just a really weird thing. I know when I started checking the Google Maps for both sites, what one sort of came across were large areas where the neighborhood was still under construction. So when you went to ground level, you would just see nothing. You would just see sort of open ground, right? And then also there was a sense of construction going on in the area. And that is something that has crossed my mind, is although I've dismissed the fact that a gun was used, I do think it's possible because we don't know the sights and sounds on the ground there, but if there was a lot of banging, with a hammer, which is typical in construction sites, there's a lot of banging and with nearby building, kind of in the middle of the afternoon, one might mistake a gunshot, with the banging of a construction site. And I wonder whether that could have happened. Personally, I don't think so, just because a gunshot is a distinctive sound, but you never know. Okay, so I'm not going to take it further than that. I think this episode's likely also to be very controversial, just because I know the majority actually don't believe quite a few of the things that I've mentioned here, especially with Chris Watts. But just in general, I think it's interesting to look at the similarities between both cases. And who knows, sometimes we're right about certain things, sometimes we're wrong. I'm not sort of coming into this to say I'm right about everything, simply just saying this is my angle that I'm taking and this is what I observe, and in terms of true crime, it's quite interesting. And what else do we see? So for me, what is actually far more interesting are the intertextualities between the Stauch case and the Frazee case, right? If you don't know much about the Frazee case, that's going to mean nothing to you, but for me, it's far more intertextual with the Frazee case. Many things, the crime scene, the disposal, the personality of the perpetrators, and so on. So that's really interesting. For those interested in that discussion, it actually forms part of the narrative Boy Interrupted, which right now is number 11. It's a number 11 Amazon bestseller. It was published yesterday. But there's a chapter, I think it's the third chapter from the end, dealing with intertextualities. Although I touched lightly on the Watts case, I touched far more heavily on the Frazee case. And although I normally put the audiobooks on Patreon under the $5 tier, I put that particular chapter on the $1 tier. So if you want to listen to it, you can head on to Patreon and check it out. I'll put a link to that in the description. I think it's a very interesting analysis. So many things similar. Red trucks in both cases. The geographical feature of Pikes Peak shared by both cases, and so on and so on and so on. Just a final point I want to highlight that I meant to get to, but I didn't quite get to, is if you look at the discovery, there's a subtle point in that it's Lena's birthday, the youngest child. It's her birthday on the 22nd of January, and bear in mind this was basically just 5 days before Ganna's disappearance, and one of Letitia's searches is about buying them presents, about it's crappy some parents don't care for their kids or buy them presents. And this was made, I think, on the 26th of January. So a day before Gannon disappeared, and a couple of days after Lena's birthday. And so one wonders, was Letitia upset that Al hadn't bought his own daughter gifts? Was Al upset that she hadn't bought gifts? Or was this still kind of a residue after Christmas? Either way, that also seems to play into a sense of moneylessness and not really having money, for things like that. Okay, thank you for listening. Wherever you are in the world, I hope you're doing okay. I hope you're healthy. I hope you're managing your social distancing. I hope you're getting enough sleep. Take care, stay safe, and I'll see you guys next time.